Local time, 5:25 a.m. Located in the Perm Krai. The Metaflax chemical plant in Kubaka City was engulfed in flames. This was once the site in Russia producing billions of dollars worth of Aleshnik missiles. This type of hypersonic weapon was once claimed by Russia to be nearly impossible to intercept. But now it has become a fire pillar soaring up to nearly 1,000 meters, illuminating the entire night sky. The secondary explosion was extremely powerful. It even triggered seismic sensors as far as Moscow. Ukraine didn't just hit the site that produced Mach-10 missiles. They turned every Aleshnik missile Russia prepared to launch at Kyiv, the entire Aleshnik missile stockpile, into weapons that will never see the battlefield. The key point is, all this was accomplished by just 2 F-16s carrying decoy missiles and 16 small, highly intelligent drones. To understand how this disaster happened, we need to go back 2 days. Back then, Russia launched 90 Aleshnik hypersonic medium-range ballistic missiles at Kyiv, right when discussions about peace talks were underway. At least 30 buildings, including apartment complexes, shopping centers, and a marketplace were engulfed in flames. At least 2 people died. More than 80 were injured. Ukraine then made a bold decision. Directly strike the site where these missiles were created. Turn Russia's most advanced weapons into missiles that will never take flight. This wasn't an ordinary act of retaliation. Kyiv viewed this as a response to Russia's massive assault. Aleshnik is regarded as one of Russia's most dangerous weapons. It is a solid-fuel missile, with a loading speed of Mach 10, which is about 12,200 kilometers per hour. It can carry multiple independently targeted warheads, which means a single missile can strike 6 different targets nearly simultaneously, delivering 6 warheads. Ukraine decided not to sit idly by in the face of that threat. They did not let this vital factory stand safe between the hills and valleys. The Metaflax chemical plant was protected by a layered air defense system integrated within the Russian Central Federal Military District, inside the domestic defense network. To defend this multi-billion-dollar facility, Moscow deployed multiple defensive rings around the area. The outer ring is formed by units from Russia's aerospace forces, S-300 and S-400 missile battalions, using long-range radar to detect, track and lock onto distant targets. Behind them are Pantsir-Su and Torm-2 systems, responsible for countering drones, cruise missiles, or any targets that penetrate the outer ring, providing close-range defense. Additionally, Russian forces deployed electronic warfare systems to disrupt enemy drone controls, navigation, and communication signals. In theory, such layered defense creates an almost impenetrable no-fly zone. To any traditional military planner, attacking this site looks like an impossible mission. But Ukraine's leadership wasn't seeking a conventional air battle. They knew Russia spent an entire year, billions of dollars, and thousands of working hours producing, storing, and preparing these Aleshnik missiles, which were used in a massive assault. Ukraine's plan was simple but incredibly bold. Do not act while the factory is running normally. Do not strike scattered or dispersed targets. They waited until the production lines, storage, warehouses, and ready-to-launch missiles were all concentrated at their most vulnerable moment. For this, Ukraine assembled a specialized strike squad. 2 F-16 Block 7072 Sea Serpents carrying decoy missiles, plus 16 small intelligent long-range drones. But this is precisely the critical detail Russian planners missed. Ukraine would not fly directly into the kill zone of S-300 or S-400. They would not act according to what Russian air defense systems expect. The chessboard was laid out. 2 F-16s and 16 drones against one of Russia's most heavily guarded facilities. As the sun began to set, the first aircraft taxied down a secret runway. The hunt was on. Local time, 1:15 a.m. On a deserted runway near Sumy, the silence over Ukraine's night sky was broken by the steady humming of 16 gasoline engines. These are 1966 G drones, Ukraine's long-range drones for deep strikes. Essentially, they're just $70,000 digital phantoms, but their range is enough to penetrate deep into Russia, about 1,600 kilometers. After takeoff, they immediately drop to lower altitude, switching to terrain. following flight mode with guidance computers, keeping them at an ultra-low altitude of about 37 meters, so low they can hide within the curvature of the Earth, after crossing rough terrain and extending towards the Ural Mountains. At this altitude, they skimmed just under the ideal observation range of the S-400 Big Bird radar, about 600 kilometers. At the same time, they used terrain and forests ahead for visual cover. Over the next 4 hours, they relied on high-precision inertial sensors and anti-jamming GPS navigation, continuously adjusting course, maintaining formation over the long-range sortie. However, no matter how low or hard to detect, 16 and 1966G drones alone weren't enough to penetrate such layered defenses. They needed a diversion. They needed a lid plane to blow open the front gate before the swarm of small drones entered. And just at that moment, the first F-16 callsign Ghost appeared. This F-16 Block 7072 Black Snake is no ordinary jet. It is an airborne electronic warfare platform. The mission is to pressure Russian radars, forcing air defense units to react and lock onto targets, thus exposing their operating rhythm. 4 AGM-88 missiles hung under its wings. These weapons are designed to hunt enemy radar emitters. But the real trick isn't in the F-16 itself. It's in the 2 ADM-160 MLDJ jamming decoys. Imagine this. You're the commander of a Russian S-400 missile battalion. What would you look for? A big target flying at high altitude, giving off strong signals, and dangerous enough to force the entire air defense network to react. At exactly 4:30 a.m. local time, the F-16 shows them precisely what they fear most. From a safe position inside Ukrainian airspace, the F-16 pilot released 2 MADJs. These aren't ordinary decoys. They're small, programmable flying units, designed to simulate the radar signature of much larger aircraft. On the radar screens of the Russian aerospace forces, those 2 little objects no longer look like decoys. They could mimic a full strike group in the air. For example, a squadron of fighter jets cruising at around 7,600 meters, rapidly approaching. Within seconds, the air defense area around the Metaflax chemical plant plunged into chaos. The operating teams didn't see 2 small night-flying devices. They saw a large, fast, dangerous threat entering the interception zone. The Russian base sprung to life. Alarm sirens tore through the icy night sky. Radars spun at full power. S-300 and S-40. Crews responded exactly as Ukraine hoped, locking onto the electronic phantoms high above. Then the launch order was given. 6 surface-to-air missiles leave their launchers, howling as they pierce the darkness, racing toward decoys high in the atmosphere. Each missile worth $2 million is fired this way, all just to chase signals created by electronic warfare. Ironically, they never even touched the EN-196 organic formation. They were completely drawn away by 2 phantom squadrons conjured by the MLDJ system, completely diverted by them. While the Russian air defenses were busy hunting those digital ghosts, the real threat was still quietly closing in. Those 16 AN-1969Gs continued hugging the ground at about 37 meters, slipping below the radar coverage zone, passing through the gap the Russian defense had just accidentally exposed. But it was this very step that turned the mission into a hard lesson. Just as the Russian radar crew thought they'd defeated a high-altitude strike group, they realized their launch tubes were almost empty, and they desperately needed time to reload. They had just unleashed $12 million worth of ordnance on targets that never actually existed, while the real drone swarm was still closing in on the factory. If you were the commander of this missile battery, and you just realized you fired on electronic phantoms, with the real threat still not visible on your screen, what would you do? Would you stay and fight relying on the inner city defense layer, or immediately call for air support? Leave your answer in the comments, hold the line, or retreat. Because while the Russians were still trying to figure out what happened, Ukraine's 6th-tier formation had already entered the kill zone, the most dangerous stage. The Russian military quickly realized the second phase of the attack was only just beginning. The F-16, codenamed Ghost, was not acting alone. Hidden behind him was a second F-16, like an aerial sniper, carrying the heavy weapon needed to turn Putin's hypersonic pride into a blazing inferno. Meanwhile, the first wave of AN-1966GS was crossing the final kill zone, around the Metaflux chemical plant, an approximately 19-kilometer ring. At this very moment, Ukraine's tactical intent became clear. These drones were no longer trying to stay completely hidden. As they entered the inner defense circle, the flight control computer issued voice commands, pulling them up to around 122 meters. Why did Ukraine do this? Because this time they wanted to be seen. Liu Jikang served as the final bait, forcing Russia's close-range defense systems to react. Instantly, the Pantsir S-1 and Torum-2, the close-in defense layers protecting the plant and surrounding a network, were dragged into the fray. The sky became a chaotic wall of shells, rain, fire, and radar signals. 30mm cannons opened up at 4,500 rounds per minute. Short-range air defense missiles leapt from their launchers to intercept the incoming low-altitude targets. This is what military analysts call an air defense saturation state. No matter how modern a defense system is, the number of targets it can track, classify, and engage at once is always limited, until the capabilities of its sensors, operators, and processors are maxed out. By launching multiple AN-1966Gs at once, Ukraine forced the Russian inner defense layer to focus all its radars and attention, firepower, and reaction time on small targets powered by ordinary gasoline engines costing just $70,000 apiece. As the Russian gunners congratulated each other, thinking they had just defeated the first wave of drones, they had no idea the deadliest threat still lurked about 97 kilometers away, that being the second F-16, codenamed Lightning. If the F-16 Ghost generated noise interference and attracted Russian air defenses, then F-16 Lightning was operating like a real ghost, flying low and close, waiting for the exact moment the Russian inner defense was overloaded. The pilot flipped open the weapon system safety covers. Below, the AGM-158 JASSM missile, a long-range air-to-ground missile designed to penetrate heavily defended areas. A $1.3 million stealth cruise missile, capable of low-altitude flight, hard to detect, and able to strike from as far as 320 kilometers away. You can think of the JASSM as the special forces of standoff missiles. Its body is made from composite materials and features airflow contours, with an angular design, meant to deflect radar waves. Its radar cross-section is extremely small, so on an air defense screen, it may show up as just the faintest signal. Even though it's about 4.3 meters long, it's built to slip through gaps in Russian radar and sensors that are hard to track in time. Then the launch moment arrived. The Lightning pilot picked the perfect moment to release. 4 JASSM missiles left the rails. Small folding wings unfolded in the darkness. They didn't climb. They dropped even lower, even flying lower than the drones, hugging the terrain just about 14 meters above ground. The missiles were guided by internal digital maps and inertial navigation. Each missile carried an imaging sensor in its nose, with infrared seeker heads preloaded with target data. This means, even if the Russian Central Military District activated jamming systems, these missiles could still match stored thermal images and structural patterns, and continue heading toward their targets at Mach 0.8. Meanwhile, the Russian air defense team, after unloading on the first drone wave, was still scrambling to reload, believing they'd just scored a victory. But they had no idea that 4 ghost bombs, each carrying about 450 kilograms of penetrator warheads, were gliding toward the target area with just 85 seconds left. But that wasn't the end. Ukraine had another layer in its plan. Knowing Russia would surely set up a layered, modern, and tough defense, not easily breached, Ukraine had planned for this. During the next wave of attacks, the final 4 drones were precisely programmed to strike at the Metaflux chemical plant, at the most chaotic moment for the defenses, storming in just as the S-400 had spent its missiles on decoys. With the resupply trucks still busy, and both Pantsir S-1 and Torum-2 were were already locked in combat with the low-flying drone swarm. Now imagine, you're the missile commander defending the Metaflux chemical plant of the missile regiment. The long-range defense is misdirected. The close-in layer is saturated. And the electronic warfare net can intercept targets that self-guide via inertia and thermal imaging. Then suddenly, Russia's most advanced, Aleshnik missile production site, is reduced to a huge stationary target, about to take a hit from roughly 1,800 kilograms of specialized explosives. Would you hold your position, counting on concrete, radar, and anti-aircraft guns, still having enough to stop a final strike? Or with the entire production line, parts storage, and unfired missiles, all in the strike zone, give the order to evacuate? Keep watching, because in the next 30 seconds, the laws of physics alone will turn Russia's hypersonic pride into uncontrollable chaos across the continent. Local time, 5:25. Inside the Metaflux chemical factory, the final 90-second countdown begins for the Olshnik production line. Inside the Kubaka plant, ozone fills the air, the acrid smell of diesel and burning plastic. Russian technicians are running through concrete corridors, trying to cut power and lock safety valves under the red alert, and isolate the production area. But it's already too late. The evacuation order was issued 90 seconds ago. The skies above the 10-facility zone have long since become a chaotic labyrinth of radar, echoes, electronic interference, air defense missiles, and low-altitude drones tangled together. The Metaflux chemical factory is not a target you can simply remove from the battlefield. The transport convoys can scatter. But a missile production line, firmware warehouse, solid fuel handling zone, testing systems, especially the finished Olshnik missile storage depot, cannot disappear within a few minutes. That is exactly the weakness Ukraine has been waiting for. On the outskirts, chaos is reaching its peak. The Pantsir S-1 and Tor M2 teams have just been dragged into battle with low-flying and 1966G drones. Some launch tubes have already been spent. Reloading ammunition. Vehicles are still in operation. Long-range radar was just distracted by false targets created by F-16 ghosts. Electronic warfare systems are still skewing interference. But Ukraine's final strike weapons are no longer entirely dependent on control signals. They've entered terminal guidance phase. About 32 kilometers away, 4 stealth missiles are performing terminal maneuvers. Their infrared imaging seekers have locked onto the largest heat source on the plant rooftop. The ventilation duct above the production zone, the heat exhaust near the solid fuel storage section, and hot spots around the Olshnik missile depot. Onboard computers quietly adjust their course. There is no stealthy rumble in the sky. Radar screens show no clear alerts. Only 4 deadly tracks creeping toward their targets. The first missile hits the production line zone. It pierces the reinforced concrete roof, then detonates inside the assembly segment. The initial blast generates an overpressure wave of about 0.7 megapascals, strong enough to tear apart industrial partitions, crush metal shelves, and bend load-bearing steel beams. In an instant, the blast core temperature soars to 3,000 degrees Celsius, turning the assembly plant into a giant furnace. The second missile smashes into the parts warehouse, where control units, guidance components, engine casings, and test equipment are stored. Explosion, shreds, rows of steel racks, casting searing fragments like countless blades throughout the building. Electrical equipment, signal cables, and composites are ignited almost immediately. Within seconds, flames have shot up to about 76 meters high, forming a thick column of black smoke, blanketing the facility zone. But the decisive strike fell on the Olshnik missile storage depot. When the third missile hit the area, it happened just as the internal fire suppression system was defeated. The initial explosion was not the most dangerous part. It was only the spark that lit the fuse. The real terror was when high-energy materials and solid fuel inside the explosive fish depot triggered a chain reaction and were ignited at that moment. Internal temperature soared to 3,500 degrees Celsius. Pressure sealed in by concrete walls, rising sharply within milliseconds. Ultra-hot air is violently compressed, turning the entire storage section into a massive pressure vessel. Then a secondary explosion occurs. A white-orange fireball blasts through the roof, rising to about 150 meters high, illuminating the entire Kubaca industrial zone. The shockwave sweeps across the entire complex, shattering glass, tearing off roof panels, and hurling heavy metal components hundreds of meters from the blast site. Seismic sensors recorded it as more than an ordinary fire. It was a major industrial explosion. Within seconds, the oceanic storage area was no longer an armory. It became an uncontrollable destructive reactor. The fourth missile hit the fuel zone and auxiliary systems. The pipes, tanks, and processing equipment there were already shaking after the initial shock. Flames raced along the technical pipeline, devouring building after building. In some areas, the temperature rises to 1,500 degrees Celsius, enough for steel to start losing structural strength. Load-bearing sections bend downward. Roof panels collapse one after another. As auxiliary compartments, pressure vessels and flammable materials are pulled into the chain reaction. Smaller explosions echo continuously. Inside the Ukrainian command center, there is no cheering. Only tense silence and technicians confirming each result. Production line destroyed. Parts warehouse burned. Solid fuel zone. Major fire. Oceanic missile depot. Secondary explosion. Metaflax chemical factory is no longer a functioning missile production facility. What Moscow once called a symbol of hypersonic power, now just a massive column of fire over the Perm territory. A giant pillar of flame. The oceanic missiles prepared to fly to Kyiv never managed to leave the ground. They died in the place that created them. The results of this attack cannot be measured simply by the pillar of flame rising from the Metaflax chemical factory. Its true significance lies in Ukraine turning a symbol of Russia's strategic deterrence into a failure right where it was born. The oceanic missiles were not intercepted over Kyiv at Mach 10 speeds. They were disabled while still inside the production line, in the parts warehouse, in the solid fuel zone, in the depot, before they could ever be deployed to battle.